Hello, and thank you for joining us for a pre-concert talk for our next Masterworks cycle. I am Ed Parsons, General Manager of the Florida Orchestra. Always a pleasure to have with us our Music Director, Michael Francis.
Hello, this is a really dynamic concert to end our marathon of concerts here in January. Isn't it amazing what the Florida Orchestra's been doing? This is the 16th concert, I believe, of 6 different programs over 4 weeks here, and to live audiences and streaming. This is an orchestra that's really doing all we can to continue to bring the music, and I'm very proud to be leading an organization with this amount of determination to meet the needs of the community at this difficult time.
And we are proud to do it. We start our program this week with Ravel's Piano Concerto in G major, and we're joined by soloist, the Israeli-born pianist Inan Barnatan. Ravel's Piano Concerto was written between 1929 and 1931. Ravel was a painstakingly slow worker, and his concerto in G was no exception. He wrote, "The G major concerto took 2 years of work. The opening theme came to me on a train between Oxford and London, but the initial idea is nothing. The work of chiseling then began. We've gone past the days when the composer was thought to be struck by inspiration, feverishly scribbling down his thoughts on a scrap of paper. Writing music is 75% an intellectual activity. This effort is often more pleasant for me than having a rest." He had begun sketching the ideas for the concerto 15 years earlier in 1913, but World War II had forced him to flee Paris, and he had left his sketches there, and they were lost. In 1927, 2 years before he started writing it, Ravel made a trip to North America, and there he came upon jazz, which heavily influenced him going forward, and this sound world made its way into the concerto. He wrote, "The most captivating part of jazz is its rich and diverting rhythm. Jazz is a very rich and vital source of inspiration for modern composers, and I am astonished that so few Americans are influenced by it." That may have been true at the time, but I think less true now. At the same time as Ravel used the very modern sound world of jazz, he also looked to the great masters of the past for his piano concerto. He wrote, "It was written very much in the same spirit as those concertos of Mozart and Saint-Saëns. The music of a concerto should, in my opinion, be lighthearted and brilliant, and not aim at profundity or at dramatic effects. It has been said of certain classics that their concertos were written not for, but against the piano. I heartily agree." Well, he wastes no time with an introduction in this concerto, and instead there is a literal crack of the whip, and off we go.
Yes, and I think this is fascinating. If you want to understand Ravel, is listen to this piece and his concerto for the left hand, which is written for the pianist Wittgenstein, who lost his right arm in the war, and commissioned a series of great pieces, because they're so different. And these are pretty much the last pieces Ravel ever wrote. He got sick afterwards, he had a brain injury and an operation, and that was sort of it for him, aside from some piano pieces. But the contrast between these two piano concertos could not be greater. The left hand has this real deep, amazing sense of a battle of will against the left hand, one man with one arm, against a huge orchestra. Whereas the concerto in G that we're about to hear is written for a small-size orchestra, and basically a Mozart-Haydn orchestra with a few extras, like trombone and percussion and a harp. But it's an amazingly effervescent piece. As Ed mentioned, it has tremendous rhythmic drive. So when we begin, the piano is in a accompanimental mode as we fly off the handle with a crack of the whip, which is the whip in the percussion, and then the piccolo leads us on a merry dance. There's a clear, light-hearted, supremely skilled sense of his capacity to bring the most out of any sound world. What you'll also notice, and this is a performance which we gave with the Florida Orchestra, myself and Javier Perianes on the piano. What you'll also notice is that there's these fantastic bluesy jazz sections in which the musicians are encouraged to slightly bend the notes as if you would do, like Woody Herman or one of the great big bands at the Village Vanguard in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. It's this amazing capacity to take in all the languages together and let it come through in an organic piece. We just performed Ravel's Mother Goose Ballet last week, and that's a real example of his fairy tale imagination. This ability to take us through certain sounds into other realms. And you'll hear that towards the end of the first movement here in the Ravel. We have this great rhythmic drive, we have this jazz quality, tremendous virtuosity for the piano, but then there's a passage for the harp, just on the harmonics, and then for the very, very high horn. And this is what you'll hear now with the strings and the winds just rhapsodically going up and down in this real light, imaginative and ethereal music is probably the right way of describing it. Extremely difficult for the high horn. So the first movement ends with a fiery little exchange, and we enter into the second movement. And suddenly now the piano's all on their own. And the piano has this very simple passage of music. There's this in slow 6, and there's a mixture between in 2 or in 3. But it is music is almost like a modern version of a Bach prelude, and just takes us into this extremely calm, restful, beautiful, plaintive place. This is one of the most famous passages of music for the English horn, the cor anglais, which actually is not English horn, it should be angled horn, is what it really means, and that's the deeper oboe. And this glorious melody, this interaction between the floating piano and this very deep human singing quality to the melody is one of the greatest moments in all of music, music of exquisite beauty and imagination. The third movement, in many ways, takes over from our first movement. It has fun, effervescence, it feels like we're racing around. There's almost a cartoon-like quality to the speed of the writing, and his sense of humor and hijinks really comes through. You'll notice that in the bassoon writing in particular. Ed was a bassoonist himself and knows how hard this is to play, and his demands for the instrument are quite extraordinary.
Practiced it many times.
Yeah.
Actually, even more difficult is the solo in the second movement. Is the high solo. Goes up to a high E. It's very,
Right.
very difficult.
There we go. So all the inner world of bassoonists. But this passage is brilliant because it's so fast, it's so fiery, and you can't help but smile, both at the brilliance of the playing, but also the ridiculousness of the writing. And then the concerto comes to a close with a fantastic sense of aplomb and delight and joy, and this classical world that we've been in, albeit with jazz as well, has set us up perfectly for our next piece, the Beethoven.
Yes, and our next piece is Beethoven's Fourth Symphony. And of the 9 symphonies, it is perhaps the least performed. This is in part because of its position between the revolutionary Third Symphony and the monumental Fifth Symphony. The great composer Robert Schumann famously described it as a slender Grecian maiden between 2 Nordic giants. It didn't help that the same year he composed it, 1806, Beethoven also wrote his masterpieces, the Violin Concerto and the Fourth Piano Concerto, which stole some of the spotlight. The Fourth takes a much more subdued approach than those that surround it, much more in the classical style of Haydn than its norm-busting, more famous siblings. We don't know why Beethoven went to a more classical approach in the Fourth, but we do know that he interrupted work on the Fifth Symphony to compose it. The Fifth did not come easy to him, and perhaps it was a way to catch his breath before returning to the Fifth. That isn't to say that the Fourth is any way conventional. We hear this right at the beginning, where he spends the entire introduction in the wrong key. Leonard Bernstein described the opening as a mysterious introduction which hovers around minor modes, tiptoeing its tenuous weight through the ambiguous, unrelated key, so reluctant to settle down into its final B-flat major. And when we do get there, it is startling, with its major key liveliness setting up by this brooding minor sound world.
I can't say anything better than Leonard Bernstein. Just listen to the beginning. That is a brilliant description. What is interesting is why he wrote it in this style, and we have to remember not to only see Beethoven looking backwards, because if we do, we have this idea of these great hills of the third, the valley of the fourth, the great mountain of the fifth, and onwards and upwards, and the odd number symphonies being more popular than the even numbers aside from the sixth, which is still very popular as well. But actually the fourth is one of his most ingenious works of art, because he really put himself back into the Haydn sound world and a Haydn-size orchestra and all those things. And it's a model in many ways upon Haydn Symphony No. 102. But Beethoven was very aware of the press. He was extremely aware of how people reviewed him, and he knew the issues they had with the Third Symphony, this heroic style, and he wanted to consciously offer something else. As we come towards the end of the symphony, I shall share some more about that. But when we get to the effervescent, exuberant B-flat major section that Leonard Bernstein so brilliantly described, we find that there is a dance-like quality, it's lightness, but because it's Beethoven, he always does interesting things with the harmony. Listen to this little loud section, and as you move into the next bit, you can feel the tension of the wrong notes in the clarinet, and A clashing against the B-flat and the horn, as he just squeezes the tension and leads us back into another section. This is what he does better than anybody else. He doesn't just have loud and quiet, or major and minor. He takes it, and then just by changing a few notes here, a few notes there, you feel your stomach twisting, and then the joy and relief when it goes back into a normal key. So usually when we get to the development section, the introduction, which is the slow passage, which Ed mentioned, the exposition, which is the opening section when we have the first section, the first subject, second subject, and all the music is presented, then it's repeated. After that we come to the development. The development is where the composers show off, and normally this would be where the harmony would get faster, you go into unusual keys, as if you're traveling to distant lands, you fragment the themes, and it's a brilliant example of compositional creativity. What Beethoven does here is incredible. He slows the harmony down to almost nothing. At one point we have harmonies that are lasting 24 bars on one chord, and he does the rest just with his oscillating orchestration between first and second violins. And this bit here you're about to hear is incredible. And it feels as if we've gone from this bright light and we've taken down into a dungeon, maybe like Leonora and Florestan in the great opera Fidelio. And we're here and it's dark. And how he uses the timpani, not just as an accompaniment with the trumpets, but now as a melodic instrument, and how the timpani sort of leads us at the point of complete darkness back into the light. And this passage of how it comes down, stays still, and comes back out is one of the most extraordinary things Beethoven ever wrote. In some ways, far more revolutionary than some of the aspects of the Third or the Fifth Symphony. It is brilliance. So the first movement ends with just a tour de force sense of joy and virtuosity. Extremely difficult music to play well. Very fast changes of character and dynamics demand a lot of the orchestra. The second movement, we have much more of a sense of Beethoven as an operatic composer. We have this sort of rhythm, bum, 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 which is clearly a military idea. And then this lovely, romantic, glorious melody that just unfolds before us in the violins. And if it's an operatic scene, it feels very much like we have a general and we have a young lady, and they're sort of intertwining. And this sense of the operatic drama of this is not to be underestimated, and it is music that is so, so stunning. Beethoven gives us this powerful sense of unity where we have this strong ideas that are played by all of the orchestra. But just after that, again, listen to what he does with the harmony. He leads us on this sense of unresolved dissonance as we try to find a way as the strings get higher and higher. And then, almost like giving birth, this clarinet just appears and takes us into another realm. It is an amazingly creative use of harmony. So then the next time we have that large, loud outburst of everybody on the same rhythm, we suddenly get thrust into something which feels like a completely different emotional world. As if we did have a protagonist who was a general, who had a stiff upper lip and all those cliches, suddenly, vroom, we see the whole emotion before us. And he just thrusts us into this maelstrom, this torrent of deep-felt emotion that is absolutely shocking, surprising, and just afterwards you feel the orchestra completely lost and shocked by what we've discovered and trying to find their way through it. The third movement reminds us of when this piece was written, and for whom it was written. Prince Lobkowitz was an aristocrat who loved classical music. In fact, he spent all his money putting on concerts and programs and premieres and adored Beethoven's music. And at his balls and at his concerts, he would often have a relationship where the aristocrats could dance with the servants. That was one of the great things. It was a unification of all of society in one place. And in the third movement, you sense this dance, which has the aristocratic elements alongside, coupled with the more peasant-like nature of the servants. Here's the beginning with these pulsating strong rhythms. Then we feel a bit shy as well. And in the trio, you hear this even more, where you have this very elegant line, and the strings seem to be in all the wrong place, putting their foot in the wrong place, and this music is tripping itself over as well. In the last movement, we show Beethoven's humor. Haydn was his great master. Haydn was the most successful composer of the time, far more than Mozart, who died in an unmarked grave. Haydn was celebrated throughout Europe. And Haydn's great trademark, I would say, is his brilliant wit, his capacity to show humor. And Beethoven shows that in a huge amount here in this movement as well. And this fast changes of character, this amazingly virtuosic writing, is shown perfectly at the very beginning. And Beethoven must have been such an unreasonable man. They say he was socially awkward and would just go into a gruff temper at any point. And listen to the syncopations that go on in the lower strings, and this it feels like a wild gypsy dance. But it's at the very end of this symphony, this brilliant, underrated symphony by many, and I don't understand why, because it's still written by Beethoven, the greatest composer of all. He gives us these little winks, these little moments where the music seems to stop, and as if we were hoping to dance with somebody, but we get left on our own at this dance, and you're kind of hoping, and at the very end the music runs off. It really feels almost like music from Tom and Jerry. It's very playful, it's very funny, it's absolutely brilliant. This is his fourth symphony, and although it is smaller than the third and the fifth, by no means is it the poor relation. And along with the Ravel, will give you a glorious, high-spirited, fun, enjoyable, funny, virtuosic, and extremely rewarding program. We look forward to sharing it with you.
Hope you can join us.
Thanks.